worst part about encountering the inexplicable is how ordinary everything feels just before it happens. That's what I keep coming back to when I think about that night during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. How normal everything was, until it wasn't. It was early 2021, during those darkest days when hospitals were overwhelmed and everyone was afraid to even open their doors to delivery drivers. My grandfather was having emergency heart surgery, and for the first time since lockdown began, I was completely alone in our house. Well, not completely. I had my two dogs with me, Max and Luna. But the silence in the house felt different without my grandfather's presence. The surgery had gone well, but hospital protocols meant that he had to stay overnight. I'd spent most of the day at my step-grandmother's house, trying to keep busy, but eventually had to return home. The empty house felt too large, too quiet, despite the familiar creaks and settling sounds I'd known all my life. By 10 p.m., I'd settled into my usual routine, trying to make the evening feel as normal as possible. I put on the kettle for tea, chamomile with honey, my comfort drink. The familiar whistle of the kettle provided a momentary sense of normalcy. Toonami was playing on TV, and I'd just gotten comfortable on the couch with my tea, half watching a Dragon Ball episode I'd seen a dozen times before. That's when the first knock came. It wasn't particularly loud or aggressive, just 3 steady raps against our front door. Under normal circumstances, any visitor at this hour would have been unusual, but during lockdown, it was unthinkable. Max and Luna, who'd been dozing off on either side of me, suddenly sat bolt upright. The change in their demeanor was instant and dramatic. Their muscles tensed and low growls rumbled in their throats as they stared at the door. My first instinct, oddly enough, was to answer it. I actually stood up, thinking I should put the dogs in the bedroom first. And that's when Luna, my usually gentle shepherd mix, did something she'd never done before. She bit my hand. Not hard enough to break the skin, but firmly enough to pull me back from the direction of the door. The knocking came again, and this time, something moved in my peripheral vision. Through the front window, a small face peered in. It belonged to a boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, with brown hair and freckled skin. But something was wrong with his eyes. Where there should have been white and iris and pupil, there was only darkness. Absolute, complete blackness that seemed to absorb the light around it. "Ma'am?" His voice was clear despite coming through the window glass. "Can you open the door? We came to play with A." A cold sensation washed over me. A was my little sister's name, but she'd never lived in this house. She stayed with our mother across town. Yet, somehow, this child knew about her. And he'd said we. Were there others? Again, I felt an overwhelming urge to open the door. It wasn't just a thought or impulse. It felt like an external force trying to make me move. My feet actually started toward the door before Luna grabbed my sleeve, pulling me back with surprising strength. Max's growls had grown deeper, more threatening. I retreated to the kitchen, my dogs flanking me protectively. That's when the knocking started at the side door, too. My heart nearly stopped. We never used that door. It had been sealed shut with paint for years. Yet there was no mistaking the sound of knuckles rapping against its old wood. The dogs positioned themselves strategically, Max facing the front door, Luna toward the side, both of them gradually backing me into the corner of the kitchen furthest from any entrance. Their growls never ceased, but they seemed to take on a different quality, almost like they were trying to warn off something that wasn't entirely human. I don't remember falling asleep or passing out. My next clear memory is waking up on the kitchen floor, sunlight streaming through the windows, with both dogs still pressed against me protectively. They were exhausted but alert, as if they'd stood guard all night. Later that day, when I checked the side door, I found something that still makes my skin crawl. Small handprints in the decades-old paint, as if tiny fingers had been pressed against it from the outside. But the paint wasn't broken or disturbed. The prints seemed to have been made without actually touching the surface. My grandfather came home the next day, and life gradually returned to what passed for normal those days. But something changed in me that night. I installed extra locks on all the doors, and I never watched TV after dark without drawing all the curtains tight. The dogs still sometimes stare at the doors and windows with unusual intensity, especially on quiet nights. But what truly terrifies me isn't the memory of what happened. It's the certainty that they're still out there. Sometimes when I'm alone at night, I catch myself straining to hear the sound of knocking. And I wonder, if they come back, will my dogs be enough to save me again? Or will that otherworldly compulsion finally overcome my resistance, forcing me to open the door and find out what these children, if they are children at all, really want? I've never told my grandfather about that night. How do you explain to someone that while they were in the hospital, something wearing the shape of a child tried to enter their home? How do you describe eyes that seem to swallow light itself? And I know what I saw, and I know it was real. Black-eyed children are still out there, and they're patient. They're willing to wait for that one moment of weakness, that single instant when our guard is down. And they remember exactly who they've visited before. Even now, as I write this in 2024, my hands tremble slightly when I think back to that night in 2007. I've kept this story mostly to myself for years, sharing it only with those closest to me. The few times I've tried to tell it, the words feel inadequate, like I'm somehow diminishing what actually happened by trying to squeeze it into mere language. But perhaps it's time to finally put it down in writing, if only to preserve the memory of one of the most inexplicable nights of my life. It was a crisp autumn night in western New York, the kind where the air feels sharp in your lungs and the stars seem to hang lower in the sky. I was out with my friends, Jane and John, doing what bored young people often do in small towns, looking for ghosts in old cemeteries. We'd done this dozens of times before, armed with nothing but flashlights and digital cameras, hoping to catch something interesting on film, but never really expecting to. The cemetery we'd chosen that night was in a remote area, surrounded by fields that stretched into darkness. The nearest town was little more than a collection of buildings that had somehow managed to stay standing despite decades of harsh winters and economic decline. And by midnight, we were wrapping up our amateur ghost hunting expedition. Jane wanted to take a few more photos among the weathered headstones, so John and I waited in my SUV, which was parked on a narrow back road lined with intermittent streetlights. The radio was playing softly. I remember it was some late-night talk show, the host's voice barely above a whisper. Through the rear window, we could see Jane's flashlight beam dancing among the gravestones, and ahead of us, the streetlights created pools of yellow light that seemed to float in the darkness. And that's when it happened. John and I were both looking up the road, maybe 50 to 65 yards ahead, when something emerged from beneath one of the streetlights on the left side. I say emerged, but that's not quite right. It didn't walk into view or step out of the shadows. It simply appeared, as if someone had cut a hole in reality itself. The figure was humanoid, wearing what appeared to be a flat-topped hat with a wide brim, something like what you might imagine a Victorian undertaker would wear. But describing its appearance feels almost impossible, because it wasn't just black, like someone wearing dark clothing. It was more like a void, a complete absence of light or substance that somehow still held a definite shape. It was as if someone had taken a cookie cutter to the fabric of the night and created a walking silhouette. The being, and I hesitate to call it that because it seemed more like the negative space where being should be, began to move across the road. Its movement was smooth, almost gliding, and I counted about 30 steps. But what happened next defies all logic and natural law. As it approached the opposite streetlight, the figure began to change. Not gradually like a special effect in a movie, but in a way that felt wrong on a fundamental level. The hat-wearing silhouette simply collapsed into itself, reforming into the shape of a cat. But like its previous form, this wasn't a normal black cat. It was that same impossible void, just smaller and four-legged now. The cat shape slipped into the fields beyond the streetlight and vanished. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the radio had gone quiet, though I don't remember turning it off. John and I sat there, frozen for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, he turned to me, his face ash-white in the dim light, and whispered, "You saw that too, didn't you?" I couldn't answer. My mouth had gone dry, and my hands were locked around the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles had turned white. When Jane returned to the car, I could barely move enough to hit the unlock button. She must have noticed something was wrong immediately because she joked, "You both look like you saw the devil himself." Her words hit closer to home than she could have known. John, this massive guy who I'd never seen scared of anything, was visibly shaking. Tears were running down his face, and all he could manage to say was cat. The word came out broken, almost like a sob. The drive home was surreal. The 35 minutes of Jane increasingly worried as neither of us could properly explain what we'd witnessed. How do you describe seeing something that couldn't exist? Every set of headlights that appeared in my rearview mirror made my heart race, and I kept checking the sides of the road, terrified of seeing that void-like figure again. John insisted we stop at his church before going home. At almost 1 a.m., we found ourselves standing at a statue of the Virgin Mary, praying with an intensity I'd never felt before. While John continued his prayers, I finally managed to tell Jane what we'd seen, though the words felt hollow and insufficient. The aftermath of that night lingered far longer than any of us expected. Jane later told me that for weeks afterward, all the crucifixes in her mother's house where she and John were living at the time would mysteriously turn upside down. It only stopped after her mother went through the house deep in prayer, blessing every room. Whatever we encountered that night there's a part of me that believes it followed them home. Years passed and life moved on. Jane and I lost touch for a while before eventually reconnecting. When we finally discussed that night again, it was like reopening an old wound we'd both tried to forget. The fear was still there, just beneath the surface. But perhaps the most chilling epilogue to this story came just recently. Days after sharing this experience for the first time online, my 16-year-old cat passed away suddenly in my arms from a medical emergency. On the very same day, merely 12 hours later, Jane's 8-year-old dog also died unexpectedly. While my cat was elderly, the timing feels too specific to be mere coincidence. Sometimes I wonder if sharing this story somehow stirred something that should have been left undisturbed. Other times I wonder if whatever we saw that night had been waiting all these years for us to speak to it. The rational part of my mind says these are just coincidences, that I'm connecting dots that aren't really there. But then I remember that impossible void-like figure. The way it changed shape before our eyes. And I'm not so sure anymore. What I'm about to share happened during my freshman year of high school when I was 14. Looking back now, I still get chills thinking about what occurred that autumn evening, and I've never been able to explain it rationally. My friends Alex and Chris had planned the perfect weekend hangout at Alex's house. His parents were heading to their cabin for a family gathering, and after some convincing, they agreed to let him stay behind to catch up on schoolwork. Alex had gotten some new video games and movies, making it the perfect setup for a weekend of teenage fun. We'd been planning this for weeks, imagining all the junk food we'd eat and games we'd play. I'd brought along some candy and energy drinks, determined to stay up all night gaming. Everything was set up for an epic night of freedom and fun. But plans rarely work out the way you expect them to. Around 8 p.m., just as we were setting up the gaming console, Alex got a call from his mom. The moment his phone rang, I remember getting this weird feeling in my stomach, like something was about to go wrong. I watched Alex's expression change as he listened to his mother's voice on the other end. "My mom called my Uncle Dave to check on me," Alex announced after hanging up. "He's coming over to stay with me for the weekend." We tried negotiating with Uncle Dave when he arrived, hoping he'd let us stay up just for one night, but he wouldn't budge. He offered to drive us home, but I declined, saying I'd walk since I lived nearby. It was only about a 15-minute walk through our suburban neighborhood, and I'd made this trip countless times before. That's when things took a dark turn. Near my house, there's this winding concrete path that circles around a small lake. During the day, it's a peaceful spot where people jog and walk their dogs. At night, the area is poorly lit, with just a few scattered lampposts casting weak light across the path. I was about halfway home when I decided to take a short break, sitting down on one of the benches overlooking the lake. The autumn air was crisp, and the moon's reflection rippled across the water's surface. And that's when I felt it. This overwhelming sense of dread washing over me, like someone had dumped a bucket of ice water down my back. I looked across the lake and noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a figure, standing perfectly still on the opposite shore. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was another late-night walker or someone fishing. But something felt wrong. The figure was unnaturally tall and thin, and despite the distance, I had this horrible feeling it was staring directly at me. Then it moved. It didn't walk around the lake like a normal person would. Instead, it began moving straight across the lake, as if there was an invisible bridge. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing. The figure maintained the same rigid pose as it glided across the water's surface, never breaking its stride. Finally, my survival instincts kicked in. I bolted from the bench and ran faster than I ever had in my life. My house was only a few blocks away, but it felt like miles. I could hear my heartbeat thundering in my ears as I sprinted down the empty streets. I reached my front door and fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the lock. Just before I slammed the door shut, I glanced back at the street. The figure was there, standing under a streetlight. But what I saw haunts me to this day. Where its face should have been, there was nothing but smooth, featureless skin. I locked every bolt on the door and ran upstairs to my room. But my nightmare wasn't over. Something compelled me to look out my second-story window. There it was, standing in my backyard, its blank face turned up toward my window. I screamed so loud my parents came running. My dad searched the entire property but found nothing. Both my parents assumed I'd fallen asleep watching horror movies and had a vivid nightmare, but I know what I saw that night. Alex and Chris didn't believe me when I told them at school on Monday. They joked that I must have played too many horror games, but they noticed how I never stayed out after dark anymore, always making excuses to head home before sunset. It's been 4 years since that night, and I've never seen the figure again. But to this day, I won't walk near that lake after dark, and I always keep my bedroom curtains tightly closed at night. Some things, you see, change you forever. And sometimes the most terrifying truth is that you'll never know what really happened, or why it chose to show itself to you.